Colosseums are here and everyone is spamming their skills and BMing in sweaty duels, and today we're going to go through my sweaty duel build for the Blasphemous Brawler. This makes a great PvP option for both duels, United Combat, and Combat Ordeal, so let's go. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to do other PvP builds and variations on like my existing builds. And this is a variation on one of my existing builds essentially. So I did a build in my Faith video called the Blasphemous Brawler, and this is a variation on that build. The Blasphemous Brawler is a melee brawling build that uses bestial incantations and the Blasphemous Blade to deal fire and physical damage. The Taker's Flame Ash of War deals fire damage in like a massive line in front of you, and you can essentially win duels off just landing this attack once because of its insane damage. Landing this once in basically every duel and like combat ordeal, what have you, that I've done will do at least like 2/3 of the enemy's health, and then following up with bestial sling, you can like chip away at that health or even just swing away with the weapon itself to try and finish them off. Now this build definitely sounds like super cheesy, and it is using like basically the most broken weapon in the game right now, but honestly you have to play cheese if you want to beat PvP, and I'm not very good at PvP. It's not something that I'm super like keen on in Elden Ring, and everyone is just like super sweaty with their cheesed builds, so like why not do it as well, you know what I mean? So Taker's Flame is a very slow wind up, and that's kind of the trade-off for like the massive like fire damage that it will do directly in front of you. The cool thing about this in like duel scenarios and these kind of PvP setups is you can run away from the enemy and then start casting it while facing away from them, and then the attack will actually spin around and target them if you do have them selected. Doing this can catch a lot of opponents unaware, like they just see you running away and they'll like try and close that distance towards you and often like jump attack into you or something like that. You'll either just get this attack off in time, or like your poise will allow you to hit through that and deal damage. Essentially, it's completely fine to trade damage as long as you're getting that attack off, and then really you can just like use that like bestial claw or bestial sling, what have you, just to try and like get rid of their last little bits of damage. It's really good in that regard. Now, in some encounters, like the opponent is maybe too intelligent to like fall for the Taker's Flame tricks. So in those kind of fights, you do have to play a little bit more straight up and actually just like using your attacks and swinging. But you can also get away with the bestial sling a lot in those encounters, especially when they're pressuring you with like jump attacks and like rolling and stuff, because bestial sling has such a fast attack animation. You can chip away at their health with that, and then once you've applied that pressure, you can usually follow up with like a sword attack or something like that. And we are also running buffs like Flame Grammy Strength and Bestial Vitality to give some HP during duels where you can't heal. But for the most part, I don't really buff unless they buff. Like if they buff, then I'll buff, but for the most part you don't really need it with this build. Like Taker's Flame does so much damage, and fire damage is really strong in PvP from what I have found. Let's go through the weapons and armor. So we are using the Blasphemous Blade. We've maxed this out, as well as the Claw Mark Seal. The Claw Mark Seal is great because it does scale with Strength and Faith, which is exactly what the Blasphemous Blade scales with, so it's a great pairing here. I'm not using any shield, and I'm also wearing the scaled armor because it's the highest like armor that I can wear with the highest amount of poise for this build. Now poise is really essential for PvP, especially in any kind of cheesy build that like is spamming something like this. Like I wouldn't say to spam Taker's Flame, that's probably a bit of an aggressive thing to say, and for the most part, especially in duels, you won't spam it. You're really trying to find those valuable moments to actually hit that ability where you can get the distance from the enemy and hopefully hit them with it. Usually like I'm spamming like bestial sling is something, like if there's something I'm spamming, right? So scaled armor for the poise, and for talismans I'm using the Dragon Crest Great Shield and the Pearl Drake Talisman, both to increase my damage negation. The Dragon Crest Great Shield for the physical damage and the Pearl Drake for non-physical damage, because we're essentially going to take damage in this build. Like that isn't really avoidable, and it's not really avoidable in PvP in all kind of regards, but essentially you want to keep your survivability up and stay alive as long as possible until you can get Taker's Flame off, and then you will succeed. So essentially that's the main goal as to why we're using that. I'm also using Shard of Alexander to increase the damage of Taker's Flame and Erdtree's Favor, just so that I've got a little bit of extra HP and stamina, and I can hit that barrier to be able to wear the scaled armor with the current stats that I have. Now speaking of stats, now primary stat is really going to be Vigor. Because it's PvP, you're going to want more Vigor than if you're in PvE, because you will take hits and you want to be able to survive as much as possible. So I've got 60 Vigor in this build, though depending on how good you are, you could lower it a little bit. 25 Mind, and I'm sitting at about 30 Endurance, though I would like more Endurance just for that like armor value. I'm sitting at 50 Strength and 50 Faith, and I've got 25 Intelligence because I was tinkering originally with using the Sword of Milos, and the Blasphemous Blade does actually get good value from Dexterity, especially once you hit 50 with Strength and Faith. So putting a little bit of Dex min-max into this isn't a bad idea. So that's kind of where my stat breakdown works, though you could probably figure out a better way to like min-max this kind of setup. For all my incantations, I've already talked about most of them. Flame Grant Me Strength for the damage increase, Bestial Vitality for the HP regen, Garuk's Beast Claw we haven't touched on. It's like an AoE version of just like the normal Beast Claw. This is really good to like catch enemies when they're like rolling out of the way, or especially in like United Combat or the Combat Ordeals, those bigger encounters there. You can usually catch a lot of enemies with this like big AoE attack. It does actually have really good range, so you can catch enemies when they're like rolling away from you. Bestial Sling we've talked about, great like skill spammable that we're probably going to use, and the Stone of Garuk is really good just as like a ranged option to try and hit enemies from like maximum distance, as most of our attacks are pretty close range. Some general like PvP tips for playing this build. Now, for the most part, as I mentioned earlier, I only really buff with Bestial Vitality and Flame Grant Me Strength if enemies buff, or in like Combat Ordeals and United Combat, I'll typically buff in those larger encounters for that reason. So in the most part in like these duels and just generally, you want to always be applying pressure, and that doesn't necessarily mean attacking. That could just mean running at the enemy and like rolling away as you like get close to them, or just like doing something. Like you always want to be doing something, running towards them, running away from them, rolling, like just like, you know, swinging or using Bestial Sling, just doing something so that they don't get comfortable and you can keep applying pressure onto them just to keep the sweatiness of the duel going essentially. And then, you know, it allows you to hopefully get them to make a mistake so that you can use that, you know, running away from them tactic with the Taker's Flame, which often if you've been running at them for a little while and then you run away from them, they're like, what are you doing? And will run at you, and then you can like get the Taker's Flame hit off where you face away from them, hit that ability, and then you'll like switch around, face them, and then slam down. I've had that happen a couple of times. It works really well. Also, you can use the poles in PvP combat just to like avoid anything that's coming towards you. It's a great like barrier of protection in some of those encounters that do have poles. With Taker's Flame having that long cast time, the synergy with Bestial Sling is something that you really need to think about and use often. Say if you've been like, you know, trying to get Taker's Flame off and spamming that a couple of times, switching to Bestial Sling, which is a much quicker cast time, will help catch enemies out if they're used to trying to avoid your Taker's Flame. And in that same way, when you're trying to keep the pressure on and like do different things, because you don't want to be doing the same thing over and over again. It really like they will just like figure out what you're doing. It's essentially like fighting a boss encounter, right? When in PvE, you know, they're always using the same attacks. You kind of get used to it. You figure out the best tactic to avoid it. So in some scenarios as well, I'll like two-hand the blade when I'm not casting. Say if I've, you know, run out of FP or something like that, you can two-hand the blade. Because of we got that strength into our build, you get a little bit of that extra damage as well. So you can mix up your tactics in that way. It's not specific to this build, but while we're talking about builds, the best way to test builds in PvP is the 2 people United Combat, because it's essentially just like constant duels, like you're just going to duel over and over again. As long as your opponent doesn't get salty when you start beating them and stop fighting like this guy did. Don't be this guy if you're watching this video. Actually fight in these encounters, even if you're losing. It makes things so much more enjoyable when we're trying to play this game for fun. It's not about the sweat. Alright guys, so let me know what you think of this build and any other PvP builds you might like me to do in the comments down below. Thank you for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Noza. I hope you have a great day.